Hello, and welcome to this session on advancing dairy's contributions to healthy, sustainable food systems. I'm grateful to welcome this excellent speakers joining us today for this important dialogue. I'm going to be introducing them here in a minute, so thank you so much to our panel joining us from really all over the globe today. It's really an international panel, and so we're super excited to be able to hear the expertise of our speakers. My name is Ashley Rosales. I am a registered dietitian nutritionist, and I'm the Nutrition Science Officer with Dairy Council of California. As a nutrition organization, Dairy Council of California collaborates with a variety of stakeholders in schools and in community settings, working together to elevate the health of children and families through lifelong healthy eating patterns. These collective efforts result in educating and supporting millions of people, including the dairy industry, demonstrating our contribution to sustainable nutrition and to community health. We are committed to collaboration, and just as Tammy alluded to in the previous session, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. So we want to acknowledge all of those who have joined us in the Let's Eat Healthy initiative, working together to improve the health of children and families. And we want to welcome all of you joining us today to be a part of our initiative as well, to make an impact in improving community health through nutrition education and through access to nutritious foods such as milk and dairy foods. So you can join the Let's Eat Healthy initiative at healthyeating.org/join. So setting the stage for our session dialogue today, achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals will require collaborative, multi-sectoral approaches to build sustainable and resilient food systems. The FAO and the World Health Organization define sustainable healthy diets as dietary patterns that promote all dimensions of individuals' health and well-being, have low environmental pressure and impact, are accessible, affordable, safe and equitable, and are culturally acceptable. Across the world, people are taking actions to create more sustainable, healthy diets. But increasingly, there is a focus on plant-based dietary approaches as the optimal solution, and more frequently, reducing or omitting dairy and other animal source foods as part of the recommended actions. Various models, life cycle assessments, dietary frameworks, and front-of-package nutrition and eco-labeling are being developed with the goal to characterize both the healthfulness of diets and their climate impact. But I think it's important to make note that gaps still do exist, and there is no consensus metrics for understanding the impacts of these emerging policies, programs, and guidelines on human and planetary health. So it's more important than ever to share dairy's sustainable and health story. And that's what our dialogue will be able to really start today. With rising rates of food insecurity and malnutrition and a global population estimated to reach 10 billion people by 2050, solutions are needed to increase diet quality and to ensure nutrition security for people are met while meeting sustainability targets. The dairy community is taking a leading role to collaborate and innovate in achieving these goals. And this panel will highlight efforts to advance these collaborative efforts, coordination, and share the contributions within the dairy sector to ensure that both high-quality plant and animal source foods are seen as a solution to building healthy, sustainable food systems. Throughout this discussion, we will explore why sustainable diets should consider the critical elements of health, environment, economics, and socio-cultural aspects, and how nutrient-dense foods like milk and dairy foods bring these elements together. So to introduce our wonderful panel today, we first will hear from Dr. Greg Miller, who is the Global CSO for National Dairy Council and the Adjunct Associate Professor in the Department of Food Science and Health and Human Nutrition at the University of Illinois. Dr. Miller is also the Nutritional Security Sector Lead for the Global Dairy Platform and is recognized as a leading voice in the global food system. Dr. Miller is currently leading the effort to enhance dairy's contributions towards a more sustainable food system by examining the intersection between nutrition, health, food insecurity, and environmental impact. And we are excited to hear that he was just recently elected to the American Society of Nutrition as a fellow. So, congratulations, Dr. Miller. Then we will hear from Dr. Stefan Peters, who is the Nutrition Science Manager at the Dutch Dairy Organization. In this function, he coordinates and carries out research on healthy and sustainable diets. Dr. Peters previously worked at the Netherlands Nutrition Center as Science and Quality Manager and participated in the Dutch Food Dietary Guidelines. Dr. Peters was a product developer in clinical nutrition at Danone Research and at TNO Pharma in the Netherlands. And our final panel speaker is Dr. Emma Gregson, who is the Environment Manager at Dairy UK, where she is responsible for overseeing the dairy roadmap, a cross-industry initiative that brings together participants from the entire dairy supply chain to reduce its environmental footprint. Prior to her current role, Dr. Gregson spent more than a decade in academia researching sustainable dairy farming and teaching agribusiness and animal science. So welcome everyone, and I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Greg Miller.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you are in the world today. It's a pleasure to be here and get a chance to share with you some of the great things that we're doing at National Dairy Council in partnership with friends across the globe. So if we could go to the first slide. What I'd like to do in my opening remarks here today is share with you the strategic efforts of the National Dairy Council, and of course its many partners, to educate on the indisputable role of dairy foods and sustainable food systems and healthy diets. At National Dairy Council, we are implementing a comprehensive, modern, and integrated science, education, and outreach plan that generates external visibility for the dairy sector and dairy foods while engaging key scientists, health professionals, and thought leader audiences. Through our scientific affairs and outreach program, we're striving to cultivate a critical mass of dairy champions who understand that dairy offers unparalleled dimensions of wellness and is irreplaceable in healthy diets from sustainable food systems, while demonstrating dairy's place in food based dietary guidance among the important stakeholders that we're talking to. We've prioritized three key areas that are our key strategies for this effort. The first is translating and sharing the science and its potential application. And of course, at this point, I'd like to thank all the U.S. dairy farmers out there who have been funding and continue to fund a lot of the research that we depend on to tell our stories. So thank you, dairy farmers, for your investment. Without that investment in research, we don't get a seat at the table. But because we have those new insights, that new knowledge, we're often welcomed and invited to the table. Secondly, we work through education to build supporters within and beyond the dairy community. So we want our dairy community to be champions, but we want other key thought leaders throughout the community to participate as well. And thirdly, we're trying to reach and engage some of the most important and critical thought leaders across the globe. These action areas are aligned with dairy's broader plans at a global level to either galvanize the sector to tell dairy's story, or to help build and share the evidence on dairy and sustainable food systems and healthy diets. So, overall, our integrated approach works to ensure that we are consistently and purposely sharing the data on dairy as affordable, accessible, nutrient rich, and relevant for diverse diets, using a narrative that ties together key focus areas as dairy contributes to sustainability and health and wellness. And you can see our key focus areas that are on the slide here. So if we go to the next slide, National Dairy Council, we work at a local, national, and global level. And in California, we partner with CMAB, the California Dairy Research Foundation, and the Dairy Council of California. We've got joint research projects that we fund together. We have educational efforts that we're working on together, and we're even working together in some of the global space and how we get out our science and our messages. So what you see on this slide here is that National Dairy Council, again, working both locally, nationally, and globally to get the data and science out. At a national level, we work very closely with the U.S. Dairy Export Council, the Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy, and NMPF. We coordinate our efforts and we rely on each other's strengths to make sure that we're putting forward the best effort we can on behalf of U.S. Dairy. We all have different strengths and we try to leverage those strengths with each other. Of course, National Dairy Council as a technical knowledge and information base for these other organizations. On a global level, we work very closely with Global Dairy Platform and the International Dairy Federation. As Ashley mentioned, I am the Global Dairy Sector Lead for Nutritional Security out of Global Dairy Platform. But again, we know that lifting all tides raises all boats. So that's why working with these international organizations on some of the pre-competitive issues that are important to all dairy sectors helps us move the dairy sector forward in terms of getting our story out there and telling that story. And you heard from Donald Moore, the executive director, yesterday, and Carol Imam from IDF yesterday, and they're shared some of the great things that we're doing together to move forward dairy's positioning in sustainable food systems and healthy diets. So if you go to the next slide, what I want to do in the next few slides is just give you some real life examples of how we are getting a seat at the table, how we're bringing our knowledge and insights to impact the point of view that's going on out in the global space. So what you see here are voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition. This came out of the United Nations Committee on World Food Security. These guidelines were endorsed of February of last year. It was endorsed by the 193 member countries of the United Nations. And what that means is that these countries agree to utilize these guidelines and take them home and leverage them at a national level to implement new programs, new policies, new investments in how they transform their food systems. Having been at the table from the beginning of this 5 year process, we were able to bring the knowledge and insights that impacted these guidelines. For example, I sat on the high level panel of experts that developed a technical science based report that was the foundation of these guidelines. Um, that brought the science to the table. And it was from that science they built these voluntary guidelines. And so it's really important that we get a seat at the table, and having new knowledge, new insights from the research that we're investing in, it really gets us an invitation to be at the table. If we go to the next slide, this is what's going on right now. The Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations was asked to develop 5 reports on the role of livestock in sustainable food systems for nutrition and healthy diets. Being a part of this scientific advisory committee allows us to submit all of the science that we think needs to be into this report. We also get to review and provide comments on each report as it's developed. And so we have the opportunity then to help shape the dialogue that's coming out in these reports that are going to be very important in defining how countries look at livestock and the role that livestock plays in sustainable food systems and healthy diets. I can tell you, I've read the first report. Dairy is well positioned in terms of how they're looked at in terms of sustainable food systems for healthy diets. And with the next slide, um, we are trying to build our efforts not only to get a seat at the table, but engaged in the dialogue. So we're looking for opportunities to present our point of view and our science and insights at international meetings and national meetings. We're asked to be on committees. We're showing up at the meetings and providing our point of view. We are really working to make sure that your message around dairy and its role in sustainable diets gets out there. Because we are grounded in science, we are considered a trustworthy partner, and that's why we are getting a seat at the table. We are working with our partners at a local, national, and international level to amplify that message. And that amplification allows dairy's point of view to be heard and utilized in the dialogue around sustainable food systems and healthy diets. So, with that, I'll hand it over to Stefan, who is going to give an overview from his point of view.
Yes, thank you, Ashley. I can start, I guess. Good morning to you all from Amsterdam, the Netherlands. That's where I am. Again, my name is Stefan Peters from the Dutch Dairy Association. And during my following slides, I want to bring you through a case. And the case is what happens if you're going to replace animal products in the diet, in the whole diet. And I'm going to talk to you about research we did and also the Dutch Institute of Public Health um, about the potential consequences of replacing animal products in the diet. And I'm going to show you two cases. The first case is a case in which we are going to replace meat and dairy by plant-based or products that position themselves as plant-based alternatives. You have a look at the consequences of those replacements. And then I'm going to show you something else, which is a bit more fancy, about how to replace, what are the consequences of replacing meat or dairy in a healthy diet. And my next slide, please. We all are confronted with, and that is what you all know, with the paradigm, we should eat a less animal, more plant-based diet. Greenpeace is advocating that, and also we all have heard of the Eat Lancet committee report, and they say, okay, eat less animal, more plant-based diets. Well, this is all based, and that is what is shown on the next slide. There were a lot of assumptions made based on LCA data, life cycle assessment, as we already mentioned them in the introduction. And based on this life cycle assessment, the carbon footprint of different foods is expressed per kilogram of product. And as you can see on this slide, it is indeed true in most cases that animal-based products do have a higher carbon footprint per kilogram than plant-based products. So to decrease the environmental footprint, you could indeed conclude that eating less products with a higher carbon footprint and more products with a lower carbon footprint, consequently, consuming less beef, cheese, and meat products, and more banana, spinach, etc. But the nutritionists among you know, and I think all of you know, that it's not that logical to replace, for example, milk or cheese by bananas or beef by spinach. These are totally different products. So why are they not easy to replace? And in the next slide, it is expressed. In the Dutch diet, and we consume quite an amount of dairy, I have to say, I think more than in the United States or California. These are figures based on the Dutch diet, and here you see that in the Dutch diet, dairy and meat are responsible for the intake of a lot of different nutrients, like dairy for approximately 60% of calcium, meat for 90% of heme iron in the Dutch diet. So if you're going to replace these products, you have to also compensate for these minerals. And in the next slide, we got a similar expression, but then for the vitamins. And here the same, you see vitamin B12, meat and dairy are taking a very important role in providing these vitamins, like vitamin A, B2, and B12. Now, you could say that very simply, and this is the first thing I'm going to show you, it might be logical for consumers and also policymakers and even scientists tend to think so, if you're going to replace animal products by products that position themselves as alternatives for those animal-based products, that you have a diet with a lower carbon footprint and as healthy as a starting diet. But this is a wrong assumption, which is shown on the next slide. And this is quite a complex slide, but please only look at the black bars. What the Dutch Institute of Public Health did, Public Institute of Health did, is the following. They, in a model which is called Optimeal, we also worked with that model. They made an average Dutch diet, and in that average Dutch diet, in the black bars, they have taken away all meats and all dairy, and replace those with all those products in the supermarket that position themselves as alternatives for meat and dairy. And if you're going to replace all meat and dairy by those products, then you could indeed have a 30% lower carbon footprint. But there are consequences for that. You would assume that replacing meat by meat replaces and dairy by dairy replaces, because these are enriched in vitamins and minerals, that the alternative diet would be nutrient neutral. But that's not the case. As you can see in the slide, If I'm going to replace meat and dairy by those alternatives, then the protein intake, calcium intake, zinc, vitamin E, B2 and B12, those are nutrients of concern in the Dutch average consumption survey, they will be decreased. So it's not that logical. Vitamin D is a bit increased, but still with consuming these kind of products, you still are not at a recommended daily intake. Fiber, of course, increases and saturated fatty acids decreases. The consequence, that's the conclusion of this slide, of replacing animal products by products that market themselves as alternative is nutrient negative. You might come into troubles when it comes to these essential nutrients. So that's conclusion one. Then the next slide, and Ashley also in her introduction told you that when it comes to a sustainable diet, a sustainable diet contains 4 different main aspects. The first one, of course, is the environment. The sustainable diet, and actually after a change of diet, should have a lower environmental footprint. It should be culturally acceptable also. People should be able to pay for it. But very important, remind the former slide, the next diet should be healthy and nutritious. And if a diet cannot provide for all nutrients that are recommended, then this diet cannot be defined as a sustainable diet. A sustainable diet should be healthy. Now, what we did is the following. Now I'm going to the next modeling we did, and it's a bit more complex. The next slide. We used a program which is called Optimeal. And Optimeal contains different kind of data. And normally I've got a very fancy way of showing you in a very dynamic way all the results that we have obtained, but I do not have sufficient time. So I'm going to show you in a moment the results we have obtained with dairy. But Optimeal does the following. Actually, it contains different kind of data. It contains the nutrient content of thousands of different products, but it also contains LCA data of about 210 products. Well, those 210 products, those combinations we have of the nutrient content and LCA data, we can go and play with Optimeal. And what Optimeal does is the following. It's a quadratic or a linear programming tool. And what it does is, for example, if I would decrease meat in my diet, with decreasing meat, I will decrease also my iron intake. I would decrease my vitamin B12 intake, and I would decrease my protein intake. What Optimeal consequently does is with every decreasing step I do with my meat intake, it will calculate an alternative diet that compensates for exactly the nutrients I'm losing by, for example, decreasing my meat intake. And the alternative diet it calculates for me is a diet that is as close as possible as to my starting diet. So the alternative diet that is calculated is the culturally most acceptable diet. And we do have other data, besides LCA data and nutrient content data, we do also have the supermarket prices of all those products. So we can also have a look at what is now the consequence of changing food groups in my diet, compensating for it, and what is the consequence of supermarket price. And for the meat example, I do not have the figure for that. We concluded that if I'm going to decrease meat in the Dutch diet and compensate it for it in a healthy way, so not losing nutrients, then indeed the carbon footprint would decrease by approximately 25%, but the price for this in the supermarket would increase by approximately 10-15%. And we did for 12 different food groups these calculations. So and at the end of my presentation, there is a link which I hope will be forwarded, and then you can check all these kind of results in a more dynamic tool. But we also did the calculations for dairy, and then we found some really surprising results. And the results are expressed in the next slide. It's almost the final slide. And here, all our results are summarized. If you look at the slide, you see lines, and on the left-hand side, for me it's quite small. You see on the y-axis grams, and the grams is when you look at the lines, that's what we consume on average in the Netherlands. So in the Netherlands, we consume approximately 144 grams of meat per day, 370 grams. Yes, we are dairy consumers. 370 grams of dairy. What we did with this modeling, we decreased dairy until 0. And what does Optimeal do then? It will calculate an alternative diet that is as close as possible to the starting diet, and you see big changes. So decreasing dairy will have as consequence that they have to consume a completely other diet. And you see that I have to consume twice more vegetables, and actually more than twice, because what Optimal does is it gives you an optimal composition of those vegetables. I also have to increase fish intake, beans and pulses, and some candy and snacks, because they're also included in this model. And the green bar on the right, that is the carbon footprint of the diet. And with the line is the carbon footprint of the starting diet. And the green bar is the carbon footprint of the diet with no dairy, and compensated for it in a healthy way. What you see there is that decreasing dairy until zero and compensating for it in a healthy way does not lead to a significant decrease in the carbon footprint. You would expect that, when people are saying consume less animal-based products. So why is that? Well, actually, the explanation is simple. I have to consume twice as much vegetables. I have to consume more fish, beans and pulses, and candy and snacks. And if you sum up all those CO2 footprints for all the foods that I have to compensate for when decreasing my dairy intake, that sum of that of CO2 footprints, that sum is approximately the same of dairy. So surprisingly, decreasing dairy intake and compensating for it in a healthy way does not lead to a decrease in my CO2 footprint. And something else, I have to eat something completely different. And you do not see, I don't think you see the red bar completely, but also it got very extreme consequences for the price, because the increase in price for my supermarket basket is approximately 1/3. So I have to pay 1/3 more to buy a healthy food basket without dairy, which people are advocating for. I do not have the expected gain on CO2 footprint, and I have to pay more. So decreasing dairy in the Dutch situation, and I think also in the United States situation, does not have the expected result if you compensate for it in a healthy way. So my last summarizing slide is this one. It's not that easy to replace nutrients from animal products. Replacing it by alternatives, that products that position themselves as alternatives, might not result, or will probably not result, in a healthy alternative diet. And dairy and meat and eggs, again, are major sources for many nutrients, not only in the Dutch, but also in the Californian diet and the US diet. And a lot of vitamins, minerals, and also proteins have to be compensated for when you're going to decrease animal products from the diet. Alternative diet is very different, especially when it comes to dairy, and the replacements are not always very logical, so very difficult for consumers to accept. And of course, the alternative diet, when replacing dairy, will have as consequence that it will have a high increase in supermarket price. So these are the results for the Dutch situation. And in a very final slide, there is a link, and that link will be forwarded to you with a short video which explains what we did, and in which you also can play with all those other 12 food groups. What are the consequences, for example, if I'm going to increase whole grain or bread intake or vegetable intake? Does it get as a result the expected increase or decrease in CO2 footprint or food price? Okay, thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here. I'm Emma Gregson. I'm here from the UK, and I'm going to share some of the work that we're doing in terms of sustainability. So to start off with, I'm going to talk a bit about eco-labelling. So UK legislation is currently awaiting the government's response to the National Food Strategy, which we did expect at the back end of last year, and we're still waiting. So policy on eco-labelling hasn't progressed much recently. However, last September, the Green Claims Code was introduced. This followed a sweep led by the Competition and Markets Authority and the Netherlands Authority for Consumers and Markets that found that about 40% of online green claims could be misleading to consumers. So this Green Claims Code sets out principles to help businesses comply with consumer protection law when making environmental claims, and it applies to any form of advertising, including front of package eco-labelling. So Alpro became a test case soon after this announcement was made, with concerns raised over their claim that their products are good for the planet. They argued that consumers would understand that this meant that their plant-based products had a lower carbon footprint than dairy. The Advertising Standards Agency ruled that this claim is neither contextualized or qualified, and there needs to be a clear distinction between less bad for the planet and good for the planet. So the advertisement has been banned, which is a small win for dairy. Next slide, please. So front of pack eco-labelling here in the UK is currently voluntary, but it's gaining traction as consumers are demanding to know more about the environmental credentials of their food. Several schemes exist to rate the environmental footprint of food, and they all use different methods to generate an environmental score, which is most often translated into some sort of grade. The scheme here in the UK that seems to have government backing is Foundation Earth's Eco Impact, and this scores products out of 100 to translate into an A star to F rating. And Foundation Earth are currently trialling 2 different systems to generate this score in a pilot study. The first method derives from work by Poor and Nemechek, and it assesses foods based on 4 criteria: the water usage, water pollution, impact on biodiversity, and carbon footprint across the farming process, packaging and transport. Their second uses a farm-to-fork method based on the European Product Environmental Footprint, or PEF methodology, which incorporates 16 categories of resource use and emissions. And these 2 different scoring systems have very different results, particularly when it comes to dairy. Within Europe, France are leading the way when it comes to eco-labelling with a system called EcoScore, and this also uses the PEF life cycle assessment plus some additional criteria. So they've included recyclability of packaging, origin of ingredients, and impact on endangered species within their score. And their system has now been adopted within Belgium, and Lidl are currently trialling it here in the UK. There have been some issues with transferring this system to different markets because particularly their calculation of distance travelled is based on an origin in the middle of France. So when this is transferred to different markets, all the calculations need to be redone, which has impact on packaging, particularly when businesses are exporting to different markets. Next slide, please. There are other issues with eco-labelling. A product's impact on the environment is very hard to distill into a single number or letter. Some systems are trying to improve on the transparency by including a QR code so that consumers can follow a link to a website and get more information about how the score has been derived. There are issues with functional unit. So Stefan showed CO2 equivalent per kilogram of product, and how this doesn't reflect the nutritional requirements of our diet. So should we be using per kilogram, or should we calculate a footprint per serving or per available protein? If we look at protein, milk and cheese are excellent sources of high quality protein, so they get a very good score, but this doesn't work out so well for cream or butter. So how can we select a functional unit that is fair for all product categories? This is a question that we're deliberating at the moment. Accuracy is also a big issue. Until more farmers are collecting the right data to calculate accurate carbon footprints, a lot of these scoring systems rely on databases that are out of date and don't allow comparison between different supply chains. And equally, here in the UK, if a farmer puts data into different commercially available carbon footprinting tools, the outcome can vary by as much as 10%. and this doesn't take into account how that data was generated in the first place. Environmental impact is highly complex. Even if we were to generate a score that accurately reflects the impact of a product, it can't tell us the impact that the choice the consumer will make in response to this information will have on the environment. So if consumers decide to purchase different products, changing demand for these commodities what impact will this have on things like land use change, deforestation, culture, and economics? So although we think eco-labeling is important, there is only so much that a consumer can understand from a score on a packet. So we need to be more proactive as an industry and change the narrative. Next slide, please. So here in the UK, we've developed the UK's Dairy Roadmap, which is a highly successful dairy industry initiative that was founded back in 2008. And it's driven major environmental improvements and continues to report progress against our ambitions and commitments. It covers the whole supply chain, and processors have achieved targets to improve energy efficiency. Within the past 8 years, they've reduced the energy usage per litre of processed milk by more than 28%. And last year, the Dairy Roadmap raised its ambitions for the UK dairy sector as a whole to achieve net zero. Last slide, please. So we're currently shifting our focus towards how farmers can achieve net zero, starting by collating baseline data for the industry. And this is really important. We can't make environmental claims without the data to substantiate those claims. We're targeting research priority areas where there are knowledge gaps, such as the impact of different feeds and diets in the cow on methane emissions. We're producing best practice guidelines to help with achieving the targets that we're setting. And most importantly, communicating the work we're doing as an industry with a wider audience. So we're sharing information with government, with health professionals, and with consumers, as well as working with international partners, including the IDF and the Global Dairy Platform. Dairy is packed with nutrients that benefit our body from top to toe, produced by an industry that's dedicated to environmental innovation.
Okay. Welcome back. Thank you so much for all of your very informative presentations. I wish we had more time. Your wealth of knowledge in this subject area of sustainable nutrition and all the various dimensions has really been a great opportunity to hear more about. I do have a few questions from our audience members that I'd like to pose to all of you now in our dialogue session. So if anyone else in the audience has questions for the speakers, please submit them. So I think I have one for each of you so far. So I'll start with Dr. Miller. Someone had asked when you were presenting, it was shared about focus topic areas that National Dairy Council was sharing, and one of the acronyms used was ICED. And can you explain what that acronym stands for, and what that focus topic was?
Yeah, sorry for using the acronym, but yeah, it's I got to try to remember them all now. Immunity is the first one. Again, looking at the relationship between dairy and reduced inflammation. Calmness. A lot of Gen Z folks want to have foods that help, that are calming to them and allow them to feel calming. D is digestive. We're looking at digestive health and the whole microbiota and how that plays into health. We know that that's critically important. Can't believe I can't remember the E. Energized. Yes, yeah. Thank you. And energy, because yes, we want to have beverages and foods that help keep us energized. And so yes, and that's the last one. So that's what that stands for. And it's a key focus of the research program at National Dairy Council. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. Someone also shared, this will be for Dr. Peters, that they really found the dairy, the Optimeal, very informative, that tool. And so one of the topics that was shared was that animal welfare is also a point that continues to be shared in looking at the sustainability side of a food's, contribution to the diet. And so is Optimil looking at other ways that they're expanding to maybe capture some of these other points in their in that assessment?
Well, you can only manage what you can measure, of course. So like animal health, animal welfare, we do not have figures for that. So that will be the main challenging thing. But you can also use land use and water use, because we got those in LCA data. And as Emmy told, like in the PEF and also the PEF-CR, there are a lot of different indicators. So when our databases are big enough to have LCA data combined with nutrient content data, and the database is big enough to have a representative pool of foods of which you have the LCA nutrient content data, then you can do similar modeling. But for the Dutch situation, we only have approximately 210 foods of which we have very good LCA data combined with nutrient data. That'll be water use, land use, and CO2 emissions.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a great point, that it's continuing to expand our knowledge as we get more data to continue to make these types of tools more applicable. And then someone also, in speaking to the same type of LCAs and looking at these tools, did specifically talk about the use of land availability. And maybe this is something Dr. Gregson can address. This misunderstanding that oftentimes the dairy and livestock sector are at the expense of land that is otherwise not actually usable for growing plant-based products. And so how do we get to a place where we're accounting for the land that livestock uses that is otherwise not usable and is a part of that important ecosystem of using forageable land?
So something we're trying to encourage here, certainly here in the UK, and there's a lot of talk about it globally, is to get more milk from grass. And here in the UK, we're very good at growing grass. We have a lot of marginal land, steep hillsides, where it's just not practical to grow crops and the soil quality isn't high enough. So certainly in our part of the world, and I know it's the same in places like New Zealand, we are producing our milk from grass that's grown on land that we couldn't use for other things. About 60% of our dairying is on permanent pasture. The remaining 40%, a lot of that is on temporary grass lays that form part of a crop cycle. So when you're growing crops, you can't continuously grow grain crops because there's a disease buildup in the soil. So you have to have something called a break crop. And quite often that's grass, and we can put animals on there. So as well as reducing the amount of disease within the soils, we are adding manure straight from the animal. So it works quite well in an arable system to include livestock. And it's a big part of adding back to the soil, including livestock within arable rotations.
Thank you. And so before we go to our poll questions, I want to let all the audience know that we will be engaging you in a poll, so please be ready for that. We'd love to have your participation. But just want to give each of you as a speaker an answer to kind of share your thoughts. Specifically, when you think of the promising areas of both nutrition science and sustainability research that highlight the unique and essential contributions of dairy foods within healthy, sustainable eating patterns, what are those to you, and where do you see us, really looking at successes within the next 5 years? And I'll start with you, Dr. Miller.
Great. It's a great question. This whole discussion around food systems and sustainability and healthy diets is a very complicated, very nuanced discussion. And so I think it's really great for us to be engaged. And I'm so proud to be a part of the dairy sector, which is leading all of agriculture in terms of doing their LCA, investing in research, looking for the knowledge gaps and applying the knowledge that they have. I think these food-based modeling systems that Stefan talked about, an expanded role for those in the future, because it will help us understand the trade-offs that are going to have to be made. We have to build in the other areas of sustainability, including social, economic, as well as environmental and health. And I know environment and health right now are in the center of the bullseye, but we've got to build in those others so that we understand where the trade-offs are going to be. This is going to be critically important because so many health professional organizations, coalitions that came out of the UN Food System Summit are calling for countries across the globe to bring sustainability into their food-based dietary guidelines. And I know that's been a call in the US as well as other countries. So we really need these models to help them look at more than just environmental impacts, but look at nutritional impact, social, economic as well. So I'll stop with that so that others have time.
Thank you. Dr. Peters.
Yeah, well, I agree with Greg. I think there are some challenges and opportunities. And well, what I started my presentation with, when we go back in 10 years, then I worked on Dutch food-based dietary guidelines. We are coming from and I think 15 years ago, the world of healthy and sustainable diets was growing. Actually, we are talking about the new science that is evolving. And by then it was just eat less animal, more plant-based. That was a paradigm. We only eat 2 food groups. And now we are advancing in time and more nuances, scientific nuances are being explored, and nuances are also forced upon colleague scientists and policymakers. And what we see, and I think we can be quite confident about that we come from an area, from a period with less animal, more plant-based only, and now we are going into nuances. As soon as you're going into more nuances, dairy will come up as a solution. As if you're going to have a horizon from a current diet to a more plant-based diet, and more plant-based, then you should optimize with dairy to keep it healthy. That's also, I think, the issue I made with my presentation. I think policymakers are now discovering that. When it comes to health, talking about food-based dietary guideline, one thing, we did our model based on nutrients, but we tend to forget the other health aspects of whole foods. And when you look at whole foods, at dairy, we know that the intake of basic dairy is associated with a lower risk of colorectal cancer, lower risk of type 2 diabetes, and better bone health. And that's unique for dairy products, and which there is lack of for those plant-based products that position themselves as alternatives.
Thank you. Great points. And then finally, Dr. Gregson, your thoughts.
I'll try and be brief because I know we're running out of time.
Yes.
But in terms of sustainability, I think research into the wider impacts of dairy is hugely important. So dairy is not just about delivering healthy, nutritious food. It's about protecting biodiversity and livelihoods and cultural identity, and providing fuel and energy, organic fertilizer. And I think research into these areas is very exciting at the moment.
Thank you so much to all of our panel speakers. We're all benefited from the information and expertise that you shared, and I think this dialogue is something that we can continue to put forward as we advance on milk and dairy's unique and essential contributions to healthy, sustainable eating patterns. And with that, I know we don't have much time for the poll, but I think we could at least do one poll if that's okay. So I'd like to put up maybe the last poll question.
Oh, we're excited now. What's that going to be? Right?
So the last poll question we have here is, I can identify actionable opportunities to advance milk and dairy's unique and essential sustainable eating patterns. And I think our speakers today really showed all the great work happening in this area. And hopefully we can continue to spread that knowledge and awareness throughout all of our, not only the dairy sector, but beyond, to those partners and collaborators in other sectors to tell this story as well. So I see here that with the results that are coming in, several and the majority strongly agree that they have actions that they can take in their roles. And then we have opportunity to continue to grow to do this as we move into the future. So thank you so much to our speakers and to all those that participated in this discussion. Have a great rest of the summit.